have a lot of experience with grading. As a special education teacher, grading was not something that was emphasized. It was more about measuring progress on IEP goals and, you know, why worry about the grades? And it wasn't until I was a college professor that I really had to start to examine grading practices and think about that. And even more so as my children, who were, as they were young children and report cards were coming home, I realized as a consumer, it wasn't making a lot of sense to me, particularly with both of my children having IEPs, and the report cards just didn't give a lot of meaningful information. And so at that time, I'd met a number of colleagues and was working in the area of assessment for students who have disabilities, and began kind of a search myself for higher quality grading practices that I could use in my college classroom, but also that I could advocate for in schools where I worked. So I think that's common, right? I think many of us who work in the area of grading and assessment didn't necessarily have that preparation as part of our teacher prep programs or our advanced preparations. It's something that really has emerged in recent years, and the field is looking for guidance. So,
and I agree with you, and I think it's still a huge problem that, especially in pre-service programs and in leadership programs in post-secondary education, that people still get very little on assessment and even less on grading. So it is an area that, because it's not dealt with in the training, we really have to deal with as part of professional development.
Absolutely. Okay, so as you work with schools, Ken, and I'll chime in with what I've seen too in the past 10 or 12 years. What are some of the most common hangups or mistakes that you see schools and faculty make as they make the shift? I know in the beginning when we started working in this area, we gave guidelines, and sometimes there have been schools that tried to implement it and they crashed and burned. Boards revolted, families revolted, and then they retreated away from implementing standards-based learning and grading. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen that now, looking back, we could help schools avoid making?
I think there are two most common mistakes. The first is not spending enough time and not being clear about the why. Why is it that we need to change from traditional grading practices that a lot of teachers, a lot of parents who were successful in school see as being absolutely okay? And so I think it's really spending time on and especially emphasizing that, you know, we are in a different world. We're in a standards-based world. We're in a world where we're aiming at success for all students, not ranking students as we did when probably most of the parents were in school. So we're in a different world, so we have to be very clear about the why. And the other area where I often see schools or districts get into trouble is around the performance standards. What do we use as our performance standards? And in a standards-based system, that should be about proficiency. We should be identifying a limited number of levels of proficiency. Well, again, that's very different, but most teachers and parents experienced in points and percentages. And so again, we have to be very clear about why we're using a different base performance standards, and be especially clear about what do we mean by however many levels of performance we choose. So I would say why and performance standards are the two main things that I see where schools or districts get into trouble.
I agree with you, Ken, particularly in the area of the, kind of this why issue. I know that when I started working in this field, that those of us, who were supporting a standards-based report card would often get excited about the idea of a move to a standards-based report card, and we would start there in teaching people about how a standards-based report card looks and help them develop the standards-based report card before we did the hard work of shifting the culture first. And so that was a real lesson for me in the past 5 years or so, is to realize that when schools did the hard work of the why, as you say, and helping to bring a whole faculty on board, with the culture shift that comes with a move to standards-based learning and standards-based grading, when they did that work ahead of time, it worked out well. You need to know how, the kind of do's and don'ts of standards-based grading, but this culture shift, and to me, it feels like the most important component of that is that everybody in the building, every single person in the building has to agree that we want every student to get there, that we expect every student to achieve at high levels, and that we see it as our job to support students, both their behavior and their learning, support the whole child to get there. So when we see practices in place that some of us refer to as gotcha grading, if it's a day late, then we're going to drop your grade, or oh, you didn't get this obscure question that I picked out, so I lowered your grade. We have to correct that. We have to correct that orientation. So when we see everybody has had a professor in college who said, no one ever gets an A in my class. You'll be lucky to get a C. That's and that person's probably a good person, probably not a bad person, but they somehow got their wires crossed, and they somehow misinterpreted, I'm a good teacher if I'm a hard teacher, and I'm a hard teacher if not many kids get an A. And so it's been my experience that we have to undo that way of thinking to lay the foundation of what needs to be put in place. So I agree. I think that one of the biggest mistakes, and it's well-meaning, but teachers and leaders, they get really excited about this move and they jump to the procedures, but we've got to slow down and really, get everybody on board with why we're doing it.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. The report card is not the place to start. The place to start is the culture and the why. And you emphasize teachers, but I think it's really important that we emphasize communication with parents as well, because some of the districts that have got into trouble mainly got into trouble because sometimes of one school board member who really got the parents up in arms.
Yeah.
And so if you don't communicate, but I contrast that, for example, I think of a elite girls private school that made the move to standards-based. In fact, didn't lose a student. In fact, now has a longer waiting list because they communicated so brilliantly with the parents in using basically every medium that was available to them.
That's excellent. You're exactly right, Ken, that parents and students have to have all the same information that we're communicating, and the way that we're learning and growing as a faculty, parents have to be along on that journey with us so that they're a part of the team and have an understanding of the why. So you and I and Doug Reeves wrote an article a few months back for Ed Leadership on what's worth fighting against in grading. What, as you think through that article, I think we did a good job of articulating where we think the starting points are. What do you see as the starting point, the place to begin? What's the first step you think schools should take in making this shift?
Well, in that article, we talked about 4 things. We talked about the use of the average, the mean. We talked about grading homework, grading practice. We talked about using zeros in the 100-point scale. And we talked about using grades as punishment for misbehavior. And if I think about those 4 things in connection with your question, what's the starting point? I would say the last one, the issue of grades for behavior, or behavior finding its way into grades, especially as punishment. And I say that for this reason. Philosophically, it may be difficult for some teachers, it may be difficult for some parents, but that can be discussed and I think worked out. Once that discussion, once some sort of consensus is reached that yes, grades should not be not include behaviors, implementing it is relatively simple. So I think it can be, you just have to decide what are for you the most important behaviors, decide how you're going to, whether they're going to be on the report card, whether you're going to communicate them in some other way. And so I think it's one that organizationally is relatively easy, but it's one that can make a huge difference. So I think it can be an early and in a sense an easy win, and then move on from that. So I look at that as being maybe philosophically difficult for some, but organizationally easy. So it's a good place to start. What do you think?
I agree. That's, and even within that, one of the easiest places can be just to remove homework. And I know that we treated that in our article as sort of a separate issue, but if we all think about what homework is and how it's usually graded, we are usually grading a behavior. Did you do it? And if we try to get into grading quality, it's hard to know how much was the student's work, how much was the parent's work, how much of it, how much space and time and, did the student have to be able to do it? So there are all kinds of variables that come into play. And so as we think about behavior, I would think even within that, removing homework from the achievement grade, separating that out. I know there have been studies that schools have taken on, not necessarily published studies, but studies that schools have taken on where when they removed homework from the grade in high school, the grades shifted. Some students had gotten higher grades because they were compliant, higher than their achievement actually was, and other students passed. Like a lot of students passed because they understood the content, but they'd not been compliant with homework. So that could be an interesting place to begin, is just to kind of do a study of that, see what changes if you remove that piece.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because there are two groups that are especially disadvantaged by including homework. One group are those students who don't need to do the homework. For them, often homework is busy work, and some of those students simply refuse to do it. And so they get zeros and Fs, which obviously lower their overall grade. And the second group are those students who can't do the homework. They're not at a point where they can do it independently. And so they don't complete it, and they get slammed, and all that does is push them down further and say, what's the point? So it basically completely destroys those students as learners. So I think, because of the impact on those two groups of students, I would agree with you completely that it is one of the things that we need to, it should be a high priority, absolutely.
Ken, you actually just kind of unraveled a little bit about homework practices in general. I mean, if some students don't need the practice, should they have the homework? And if some students can't access it without support, is it appropriate for them? Should everybody get the same homework? And I know that's probably beyond the scope of our conversation today, but really good food for thought for us all. Do all students need the same homework? And I think most of us would agree, no, they probably shouldn't have the same homework. If everybody needs a different kind of practice, then give everybody the kind of practice that they need to help them reach the next step.
Yeah, I mean, if you go and watch a practice of any sport where there is a good coach, a high quality coach, the players may all do the same thing for some of the time, especially at the beginning, but after a pretty short period of time, the players divide into groups to work on the things that they need to improve on. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen what I would consider to be a good practice for a sports team where all the players did the same thing all the time, but that's often what we've done in homework.
Absolutely, and in our classrooms, like what you've just described is multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, and flexible grouping in a classroom. We shouldn't be talking at kids for an hour and then send them all with the same homework. We should be talking shorter amounts of time and then move to flexible grouping, not only in elementary school, but in high school. So yeah, so even though we're talking about assessment and grading, it certainly touches all aspects of how we design and implement our curriculum. So it sounds like we really agree that it's important for schools to build culture before moving to these procedural changes in a report card. What do you think the first common understanding that leadership should have in order to kind of build this culture in their faculty?
I really think the first thing is being clear about the purpose of grades. And I say that because I think our problem, the problem often with traditional grading, has been that we've tried to have these little summary symbols meet a whole variety of different purposes. Grades have had a communication role, they've had a self-evaluation role, they've had a motivational role, they've had a sorting and selecting role, they've had a program evaluation role. Somehow or other, we thought that little symbols could do that, all of those, and do them well. And in fact, that's not the case. They can't do all of those well at the same time. So what I think is absolutely critical is a school, a district, has to decide what for them is the primary purpose of grades. And I believe that we should see the primary purpose of grades as being communicating achievement. How are students doing on the standards? And I think once we establish that as the primary purpose, where that gets us to is if we have any doubts about what we're doing, if we have any question about should we do A or should we do B, if we go back to purpose, then purpose is our compass. Purpose gives us a sense of direction. If we go back to our purpose, almost always it will be clear. If this is truly our purpose, then we should do this, we shouldn't do that. And of course, that leads also to what we talked about a little bit before, being very clear about the standards. So being clear, establishing a primary purpose for grades, and then working on that standards-based mindset.
Yeah, that's I've kind of been thinking about the purpose lately, and kind of been evolving in my understanding of the purpose, and certainly to communicate where students are, communicate it accurately, to communicate it fairly, certainly in the work that I do with students who have IEPs or students who are below grade level for whatever reason, thinking about how do we communicate that accurately and fairly. I also feel like a primary purpose of grades during the formative period, so during the entire course up until the end of a class or a course, is really to inform our instruction. So we've got to have data and grades and a way to consume that, that we can do so efficiently and on what matters. We want to be measuring what matters most. So if it's to inform our instruction, that should guide what we measure, and it should guide how that looks. And it helps us to realize that practices like averaging grades, that doesn't make sense if the purpose is to inform instruction. Because if the purpose is to inform what I do with intervention or with general teaching strategies, I need to know what students can do right now. And when that gets muddied with where they've been, where they were 8 weeks ago, and I can't really tease out where they are right now, I can't make a good instructional decision for right now. So that's, so communicating accurately and fairly, but also for the purpose of informing instruction, because that's the ultimate goal. I saw a post on Twitter the other day, and I retweeted it. It was, make sure I get the quote right. No, none of us. Oh, it wasn't on Twitter. It was in the Ed Leadership. It was in the latest issue of Educational Leadership. I'll have to dig up the quote, but it was something along the lines of, none of us took on a career in education because we had a passion for higher standardized test scores. That's not why we did it. We did it so we could help students learn. And so that's really the ultimate purpose here, to have high quality data that can inform our instruction. So we can.
And what's really important about what you said, and I would agree with you completely, is we don't have high quality useful data that informs our instruction or informs students about their learning if all we have is that the students got 30 out of 40 on this test, or a B on this test. That it's only when we break it down into standards, benchmarks, learning targets, whatever we want to call them, that we have useful information. I mean, and so that's, what you just said, another reason why we need to be standards-based, so that we have that breakdown of information that provides information at a bite size that we can actually use to make decisions about teaching and learning.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was an article in that same issue, the end of points, that that makes that point very clearly. 35 out of 40 doesn't tell us anything. Knowing what a student can and is ready to work, can do and is ready to work on is really much more useful. So if this is the place to begin, helping faculty understand the purpose of grades, helping our faculty come to a shared agreement or shared understanding of the purpose of grades, how should leaders go about that? How should leaders go about kind of bringing everyone to shared understanding about the purpose of grades?
Well, I think that a good way to do that is through providing faculty with materials to read, to reflect on, and then discuss. And so whether that's an article from a journal, whether it's a chapter in a book, I mean, I've certainly heard from lots of schools that one of the things that helped them the most was doing book studies together. And that, so I think it's about the leader doing things that turns the teachers into reflective teachers, reflective learners about what they're doing themselves. And I think part of the problem, and I'll admit it was true to me about me when I was in the classroom, I was not a very reflective person. And I just did what had been done to me and what I learned about. And I have subsequently become much more a reflective teacher, a reflective learner. And I think that's what the leader's role is to get teachers to be reflective about the teaching, to be reflective about the learning, and use whatever resources in their judgment will work best with their faculty. Would you agree with that?
I would, Ken, and anybody out there who's feeling guilty about using grading practices that are inconsistent with these, don't feel guilty. We've all done it. I would agree, Ken. My first few years in teaching at the college level, I didn't use great grading practices. I used points, and those points converted into letters. And it wasn't until I was 4 years into my college teaching career that I really reflected on and sought out better practices for grading after conversations with colleagues. So yeah, so I agree. It's the responsibility of leaders to provide guidance for faculty to go on the journey, provide positive pressure and support, but not just top down on procedures, but actually the pressure and the support for faculty to really be able to have deep conversations so they can arrive there. You can't drag people along here. You have to provide resources and support for everyone to arrive kind of at this place on their journey themselves.
And I think that what you just said about pressure and support is really important. It needs a judicious combination of both. And that, I can never say what that is for a school or a district, because it depends on the culture and tradition of the school or the district. But my experience is, if a school or a district only works at the pressure end, what you get is lots of subversion. You may think that you've moved ahead, but you really haven't. And I can think of some places where that happened.
Yeah.
If you only work at the support end, just talk and talk and talk and talk, if there's no sense of, well, we are going to move at some point, then nothing happens. It just sort of goes on like that forever. So I think when you mention pressure and support together, you're absolutely right. It does need to be a judicious balance of pressure and support.
Well, as you know, most of my career has been supporting students with disabilities or students who are behind grade level, some of which don't have disabilities but are instructional casualties, if you will. How do you see that schools are ensuring their standards-based learning and grading policies are meeting the needs of these students who are temporarily or maybe long-term behind grade level for whatever reason?
Well, I think my immediate response would be in lots of cases they aren't. That this is still an area where schools and teachers individually and collectively have a huge amount of difficulty. But I think standards-based approach actually can be a real help here, because it does get to what are the specifics of those students that have abilities, or as you put it, are instructional casualties. Because what those students need is what are the specifics that they need help with, and it's from standards-based assessment, from being really focused on learning goals, that we get that information. I think the other part of it, where I often see teachers struggling, and where you give wonderful advice, and you may want to say a little bit about it, is being clear about the difference between accommodations and modifications, and then deciding how that impacts on the assessment process, on the grading process. But to me, I see a lot of hope with standards-based grading, because it does provide the information much more that's needed. But I think there's still a long way to go. But it's your work that really helps in this area.
Well, there are a lot of people who work in this area. I appreciate it, Ken. I agree with you that most of the places where I've been, they see that this is a next step, or an extra step, that this is next. We need to get our grading practices solidified, but then we'll worry about how do we make those changes for students who are behind grade level. And I really wish that schools would see this as fundamental. It's necessary. You don't want standards-based grading for some students. You want standards-based grading for all students. And frankly, the students in the building who need the best information on how they're doing, where they are, and what they need to do next are the students who are behind grade level. And we know that they're currently, with standards-based grading and without, they're currently getting the least useful information, especially students who have IEPs, because there's this myth that you can't fail them, yet, so pervasively in high school, students who have disabilities are often getting low passing grades. And it's the area of IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, of area of lowest compliance for states. So I wish more schools would take this on and consider this population of students in the beginning, not as an add-on, not later.
And one thing that we didn't mention when we were talking earlier that I think applies here as well is that we need to be, for all students, but especially for these students, we need to be de-emphasizing grades. The scores and grades are not what provides the most useful information. It's descriptive feedback. It's the words that describe the strengths, that describe the areas for improvement. And I mean, I would consider myself somewhat of a struggling learner, for example, when it comes to playing golf. And occasionally I take lessons. And no golf pro has ever said to me, "You get 7 out of 10 on that swing," and this is practice, or 7 out of 10 on this lesson. If they did, I would never go back to them. What they do is they give me descriptive feedback on what I did well, what needs improvement. Maybe I do a few more swings, and then they ask me what worked, what didn't work. They push me to self-assess. So I think it's really important to recognize that we're talking about standards-based grading. One of the things that really is part of standards-based grading is less scores, less symbols, and more words.
Yeah, especially along the way, like during the formative period. And what you're bringing up now is that our classroom assessment practices, our day-to-day assessment practices, are really more important than our report card procedures. Yes, we want to get that right. Of course we do. But in the meantime, and someone asked a question related to this a minute ago. Someone wrote, any suggest, no. I don't see it, but somebody here asked, basically, any recommendations for how to start working towards standards-based grading in my own classroom when the school is not ready to make the move altogether? So what you're saying is your school doesn't have a standards-based report card, but there are plenty of things that you can do that are even more important than the report card in your own classroom. You can pull behavior out of the grade. You can stop including participation and homework in the grade. You can emphasize feedback over points. You can stop averaging. You can stop calculating percentages and instead assign grades on assignments or not even assign grades on all assignments and provide feedback to help students really learn and grow. So that's certainly an important component of making that move.
Can I give an example to
yeah.
illustrate? A few years ago, I worked in a high school in Michigan. At the end of the summer, the principal wanted the teachers to know that there were some people out there with some crazy ideas about how to do grading differently, and made it very clear to me that he was not proposing any changes. But after it, the freshman English teachers got together and they came to the conclusion that the reason why most students failed freshman English was not because they couldn't read, they couldn't write, they couldn't analyze literature. It was because of their behaviors. And they identified, and I can't remember specifically what they were because it was a few years ago, but they identified 4 behaviors that they thought were critical to success in freshman English. And they made up their own supplementary sort of little report card. And after the first parent-teacher conference for that year, the parents of those kids were ecstatic. They said, you're sharing things with us about our child as a learner. That's really useful information. And so, and that wasn't one teacher, that was 4 teachers, but that really was teachers working individually when the school as a whole was not moving forward.
All right, so several questions have been posed, and I have a final one I want to ask you, but I want to jump to some that have been posed during this to make sure that we respond to you all. So one person asked, the performance level is what seems to trip up our district. We have 4 levels, 1 to 4. We define 3 as proficient and 4 as exemplary. However, we've had a hard time explaining how very smart kids only get 3s when there is a higher option of 4. What can we turn to for helping teachers and parents with performance levels?
Well, I think one of the ways of doing it is to look for examples outside of school and wherever. I mean, I think it can be in the arts, it can be in sports, it can be in all sorts of areas, and identify in those areas what we would consider as proficient and what we would consider as exemplary. And having said that, I would say I have a little bit of difficulty with the word exemplary because I think that suggests almost perfection. And I think it's really important that we don't see the top level as being perfection. It's better than proficient, but it's got to be attainable. And I think exemplary almost suggests something that isn't.
That's a good point. You know, the other piece we want to make sure, and for those of you who didn't ask this question, it's good to have the answer for this one because this has been a sticking point in a lot of districts where I've been. They didn't use the word exemplary. They would use the word exceeds the standard. So exceeds the standard. We'll just cut to the chase there and tell you don't use that. Just don't try to avoid that one. But exemplary could end up having the same problem if it's not well defined. Any of the categories, any of the words, as long as it's well defined and is accessible, it is attainable, that's great. But what we've seen is, you know, the top category ends up being something that's reserved for the elite few, and you don't want to do that. That's sort of a opposite of the direction of standards-based learning where we want everyone to get there. But sometimes there can be pressure for this. We want to be able to distinguish, you know, these top performers. And essentially from a data perspective, you're talking about outliers. You want to be able to notice that a student performed exceptionally high, but you don't want to reserve a place on your scale for that. You want to explain any kind of exceptional performance in narrative. You don't want your top category also to be surprise me, you know. You want to define exactly how that looks. And for those of you like this person who's having difficulty explaining the 3 and the 4, I mean, certainly students who have performed highly, you know, may not get a 4 in everything, you know, but once you break a subject down into discrete skills or categories or strands of standards, Todd Rose in his book, The Myth of Average, talks about the jagged learner profile. Every one of us has it. Every one of us is really great in some things and not really great in other things. And so when we change the way we grade to show these categories, there will be students who maybe are used to getting all A's or all high percentage because they've learned how to play the game of school, who, when we're very honest about how they're performing in certain categories, get a lower grade. I think the key is to coming back to the purpose. If the purpose is to inform our instruction, we want to know where students are needing additional support. So by highlighting where a student is not at that top level or is struggling, that allows us to provide the support and strategies to get the student there. So, you know, reframing that conversation with families as this is not about justifying a grade, it's about identifying your child's strengths and areas where I need to work to support your child.
And Leanne, I think it's really important that we emphasize that this isn't about grade inflation or grade deflation or making it difficult. We need to be realistic about it. What do we mean by proficient at a grade level on a standard? And what do we mean by excelling or advanced on that? So first of all, I think we need clear descriptions, and then we have to teach for it, and we have to assess for it. Students have to be able to demonstrate that level. There have to be opportunities for students to show a level above proficient. And sometimes that's been the problem. And then the other thing I think we need to do is we need to develop exemplars where we can show, whether it's in a written or whether it's a video or whatever, where we can clearly show this was the proficient piece of writing, this was the excelling or advanced piece of writing, so that, you know, students, parents, whomever, who say, why isn't Jimmy getting a 4 or why isn't Jimmy getting an A? You can look at these exemplars and see that, yeah, Jimmy's writing clearly was proficient. It wasn't above proficient. So exemplars are a really important part of this as well.
And I think just in shifting that conversation, you know, why did Jimmy not get a 4? Well, Jimmy is at a 2 right now, and this is why. So these are the strategies we all need to put in place to get him to a 3 next. You know, shift the conversation forward, like this is what we need to do next, because that's really what the conversation should be about. Also, I want to emphasize too that we don't, you know, unless you're implementing these practices by yourself in your classroom, if your school is making this shift, you want to calibrate this. Like you want to make sure everybody in the second grade team has an understanding of what a 3 looks like on this skill, and everybody on the science team in high school has an understanding of this is how a 3 looks on this skill. So you want to bring together subject area or grade level teams to calibrate and discuss points of agreement and disagreement to make sure we come to consensus on what each of the categories means and how it looks within any given task.
Absolutely. I mean, if we're doing this well, unlike when I was in school, and probably you were too, Leanne, where we talked about who were the hard teachers and who were the easy teachers.
Yes.
If we're doing well, that would never be part of what we would hear students saying.
That's exactly right. So how might we respond when a parent responds to the 1.4 scale saying, so we're going back to grading like we did in elementary school?
Well, I would say that we're going back to grading like has been done at the post-secondary level, going back to what, 180 years ago. It's actually been more at the post-secondary level that it actually started with levels of proficiency. And I would say also probably in the workplace, where people are evaluated as generally as being on a scale of proficiency. So I would say that it's actually more the reverse of that. It's actually the workplace and post-secondary where they look more in terms of levels.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you know, I chair the classroom assessment special interest group for the American Educational Research Association. And I can tell you within that community of scholars and researchers, this is not controversial. This is high quality measurement using percentages as a proxy for measuring learning. There's no evidence to support that way of measurement. There's no scholar out there in classroom assessment who's recommending the use of percentages or averaging. So really it's about staying with what's current and moving to higher quality measurement.
But it is what parents know. So
it is what they know.
It's about the conversation.
So we have to communicate it well. So another person wrote, I've become very interested in having learners gather evidence to demonstrate proficiency rather than relying on a single assessment. Do you have any suggestions how to make this manageable and meaningful for learners and for teachers?
I think one of the best ways to do this, and I keep hearing this from teachers, and I see teachers talking about it, you know, in the appropriate Facebook groups and Twitter chats, that one of the best ways to do this seems to be with digital portfolios. You know, there's all sorts of programs out there now, all sorts of ability to do wonderful collections of evidence of student achievement, have students reflect on those, have students see where they were, have students reflect on their growth over time, and ideally share that with their parents as well. So, I mean, it used to, I think, be very laborious to, you know, to do this as a hard copy, solid portfolio. But the digital portfolio route seems to make this far more manageable for teachers and for students and for parents.
Yeah, and related to that question and the question that was just posted, what are some of the best examples you have for reassessment procedures to avoid a mad rush of students at the end of the grading period? There are additional answers to that. But for both of those questions, you know, as a college professor, I found that I was doing too many quizzes because that's what had been done to me. So I was giving too many quizzes and not enough like meaningful kind of projects that build on one another. And so I guess to answer both of those questions, one piece of the answer is this doesn't always have to be gathering new pieces of evidence, but rather revising and improving upon a single project can be one way to make that manageable and to make that manageable, because those are both questions about being able to manage it. So it may be that a student in this project or, you know, piece of evidence that demonstrates proficiency on multiple standards, well, maybe a good portion of it, they've demonstrated mastery of the standard, but they need to develop and work on one portion of it so they can revise that component, which makes it more meaningful. I've seen a number of suggestions about due dates and how, you know, we don't want punctuality to be in the grade, you know, kind of ways to work around that. So I'd be curious in your feedback about that too, Ken. How do we keep it from being a massive revision time at the end of the semester or at the end of the year? I never experienced that as a college professor, but I do recognize that I was teaching a different population than everybody in K-12 in terms of maturity level and so forth. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm talking mainly from my experience as a high school teacher, and I was very clear with my students that I would not accept anything in the week before the day when grades were due. I was not willing to put in all-nighters and, you know, have a crazy week in that week leading up to, I had enough to do, determining the grades and writing things on the report cards. So that's the first thing, maybe not the most important, but the first that I wanted to mention. I think we have to be very clear with everybody that we have expectations about timelines, that meeting timelines are important. And if every student met every timeline, we wouldn't even have to talk about this, but the simple reality is they don't. And so we have to say, what are we going to do? And I think that really what it has to be about is those students who are not getting things in a timely way have a problem, in the same way that students don't understand fractions have a problem. And our job as teachers is to support and help students who have difficulties, who have problems. But it seems to me that what we have to do is we have to find out why. Is it because they're fully organized? Is it because they're lazy? Is it because things are happening in their life outside school that make it difficult for them? What is it? Provide support for that.
And all of those require a different kind of support. Like you chose not to do it versus you weren't organized versus you didn't have the support at home too.
Yeah. And then I think we need to say, if only for the things that are going to be scored as part of grades, not for every little thing along the way. These are going to be done. It's far better that you do it late than you don't do it at all. And so we will provide time and support for you to get it done. Now, in some schools, they do that before school, lunchtime, after school. What I'm seeing increasingly in both middle schools and high schools is building support periods into the timetable. And that seems to me to be a really powerful way to do it, because we're saying more clearly then, this is what we're about. We're about helping students rather than we're going to deprive you of your time at a time when you would rather be doing something else. So I think it's a more efficient way to do it, but it also sends a powerful message that as a school, this is what we're about. We're about helping students.
Absolutely. And the whole child is our responsibility, not just the amassing of content knowledge, right? And, employers are going to care much more about the approaches to learning or the habits of mind, if you will, those, or soft skills, all of those have nuanced meanings, but are similar, right? And so how we support those is as important as everything else that we support. So two people asked questions about what happens if the district, you just said that we should start with the culture, not with the report card. Whoops, what if the district skipped that and we're in trouble? What do we do? What do we do to get back on track if the district skipped the step of clarifying purpose or establishing culture? What should we do to get back on track?
Well, I would say as much as possible, and it may be difficult, but to try to have at least some of those discussions and come to some consensus about purpose, for example. But the other thing, and I may be starting to sound like a broken record, but if they've skipped that step and you're going to have a standards-based report card, work on your standards. Make sure that you know your standards. Make sure that your instruction is standards-based. Make sure that your assessment is standards-based, so that you have the information that you need to honestly and accurately complete that standards-based report card. Would you agree, Leanne?
Yeah, I do. And there's no reason you can't, at this point, implement the strategies that we talked about earlier. Ken's suggestion of a book club, there's no reason that you can't, just because you started with the procedures, no reason you can't now say, hey, it's time that we want to dig in and really reflect on why we're doing this and build our purpose and think about what we need to do in our classrooms to support this shift, to support the spirit of the shift. So I certainly agree with that. Another person wrote, our district is struggling with the broad spectrum of a 2, which it sounds like you've defined as making progress. There's minimal progress all the way to almost proficient. So I'll tell you the way that I usually respond to this, and that is when you're defining the labels for your different categories. So in a standards-based system, you're going to have multiple categories in order from lowest to highest, And you need to come up with labels for those. And labels can be problematic. Certain labels are more problematic than others, and making progress or progressing is one of those, because if we think about how that actually looks with our data, if it's no progress, progressing, and mastered, for example, almost nobody's making no progress. Almost nobody along the way has mastered it, which means everybody fits into progressing, and you can't distinguish between the students who are making some progress but you're worried about and the students who are really making loads of progress and are not there yet. So you want to think about those labels and then clearly define what you mean by those. But if the purpose is to inform our instruction, we need to have enough categories to distinguish between the levels of performance that correspond with different types of instruction and support. So if a student is making a little bit of progress, but we're worried, we want to have that information so we can respond with the appropriate intervention and strategies to support that student.
Can I just add something to that?
Please.
A student could be making progress at a very low level of achievement. To me, what this reveals is a lack of understanding that progress and achievement are not the same thing. Achievement is the absolute level. Student is proficient in, they're close to proficient in grade 2 reading. So it's an absolute. You're achieving at a level. Progress is relative, and it's relative to proficiency. How much has the student moved over a period of time? I think we very often confuse achievement and progress. We certainly should never have a scale where some of the descriptors are progress and some are achievement. They need to be consistent in the nature of the what it is that we're seeing as that changes in the scale. And I think a good example of it is that very often school districts call the first report card school year a progress report. It has traditional letter grades on it. If it has traditional letter grades on it, it's an achievement report. It is not a progress report. So to me, part of the answer to this is making the clear distinction between achievement and progress.
All right, so we've got a couple of more that we have time to get to. One person wrote, what is the best electronic platform for organizing standards-based grading? I'm familiar with Jump Rope. Are there any others we should be aware of?
Well, I have to make a ethical conflict of interest statement first in responding to this, because for a number of years I have consulted with Power School, especially around the gradebook Power Teacher Pro. So I'm not what would I call myself, a free agent when it comes to talking about this. But it's really important that you make a distinction between two things. Are you talking about a standalone gradebook like Jump Rope, or are you talking about a gradebook that is part of a student information system? If as a school district, you have a student information system with a gradebook like Power School, then probably you're hooked into it. And I'm biased, but I believe it is very good if it's part of a student information system. As far as standalone programs, I think I hear good things about Jump Rope. I'm hearing good things about Fresh Grade. There's one now called Teacheries. There are a whole lot of standalone programs out there. So I think you have to be clear, is it a program that's part of an SIS or is it standalone? And look into it in those categories separately, because generally speaking, you're either using a standalone or you're using it as part of a student information system.
That's okay, a good point, a good distinction to make. And most recently, I've collaborated with the makers of Otis and seeing good things there. So I think there are a variety of options out there for people who are interested in that. But I have to disclose, I haven't spent a whole lot of time in the actual grading programs. I use Schoology. There are things I'd probably change, you know, if I could. But there's a way to use standards-based grading within Schoology as well. So
standalone program.
Yeah, Schoology is a standalone program. Yeah. So we're really at the end of our time. So just as our kind of final thoughts, Ken, With regards to communicating student learning, are there things that make you optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, I'll start off with pessimistic first. I'm pessimistic about the pace of change at the high school level, because it's actually at the high school level that it's most important grades be accurate, consistent, and meaningful, because it's really only at the high school level that grades are high stakes. And I see so many districts where they're doing standards-based for elementary, maybe for middle school, and then they just stop for high school. That makes me pessimistic. What makes me optimistic is some of the changes that I'm seeing people talking about in terms of high school transcripts. There are some school districts, especially in Vermont and New Hampshire, we're looking at proficiency-based transcripts. And the other one that I think is very exciting is the Mastery Transcript Organization, a consortium of initially about 105 private schools who are talking about a high school transcript that is very different from the traditional. And so you can see here what the earned credits are in, the analytical and creative thinking, the complex communication, and so on. In terms of this, this is actually a figure from one of my books. I would like you to notice what's on the bottom, because the Mastery Transcript Organization is very clear about this, that this is an ongoing work, that what you see here is the prototype as of July 2017, and it's probably changed by now. And if you're interested, please go to www.mastery.org and you'll see a lot more information there. Deanne? Yes,
and then Ken, you have a new book out. Would you like to tell people about this, and then we'll be finished?
Okay, the fourth edition of what was my first book, How to Grade for Learning, came out in October of last year. And it is a fairly thick volume, which really wasn't what was intended. But what I think is really useful in the book is that I have 48 educator contributions, including one from Leanne, from American educators, from Canadian educators, and from international educators. Basically, for the most part, people that are in classrooms in the schools. So it's got a lot of really practical stuff in it. There's one chapter on each of the 8 guidelines, and then throughout the book, there are these educator contributions. And I'm really excited about it. Of the 4 editions, I think it's the best, and I hope people will see it that way too.
All right.
Okay, Leanne.
Thank you for joining us, Ken. Thank you all for joining us today. And please visit studentgrowth.org to keep up to date on our next conversation. Ken, I hope you'll join me for another one in the future. This was really fun. And I hope everybody finds it was useful. And have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Leanne. Bye, everybody.
Bye.